Good day, everyone! Londononion here, continuing our Challenger Prime build, fitting for the Apocalypse difficulty. And our secondary for this discussion is the Handler. Just like our previous video, we have discussed this pairing in the past, but with the archetypes reversed. Since the Prime perk of the Challenger and Handler are somewhat similar, their positions as Prime and Secondary may be interchangeable. However, with our intended use of our doggo companion, Rufus, this onion has a slight favor with the Challenger as Prime. I would argue that the Challenger and Handler are not an intuitive pairing. At the same time though, the Handler is one of those versatile classes that can merge with any other archetype for solo and co-op purposes. The Challenger, on the other hand, is all about close quarters combat and donning heavy armor. The Handler archetype trait, Kinship, won't have much use in this build, but this will be of little consideration. Without further delay, we'll transition to the build. For this build, I equip the Leto Mark II armor set, and the relic I employ is the Void Heart with mythic armor effectiveness, stamina cost, and melee damage. The Crystal Heart is also an option, though for this build, this onion prefers to maintain mobility as much as possible. As for the armaments, there are two sets of primary and melee weapons we'll employ. Meanwhile, the secondary will remain consistent. For the first primary, I employ the Bulldog Auto Shoddy with the Blood Draw mod and Fetid Wounds Mutator. The maximized effect is the Focus. Upon a weak spot or critical hit, targets will become corroded for 540 corrosive damage units over 10 seconds. The secondary I equip is the trusty MP60 with Corrosive Rounds and Twisting Wounds, which increases damage to bleeding targets by 20%. The maximized effect allows ranged weak spot and critical hits to apply bleeding for 540 damage units over 10 seconds. As for the melee weapon, I go with the Huntress Spear and the Vampire Blade Mutator for an increase to melee damage by 25% when within 10 meters of a bleeding enemy, and a maximized effect of 3% lifesteal of base melee damage dealt to bleeding targets. As for the second set of primary and melee weapons, I equip the Coach Gun and the Spectral Blade. As a potential tertiary option, the Stonebreaker will also suffice. But for the Coach Gun and Spectral Blade, I apply the same mods and mutators respective to the previous weapon set. The reasoning behind these choices will be discussed closer to the end of our discussion. Moving on to the gems and trinkets, the amulet I choose to lead this build is the Ravager's Mark for an increase to all damage by 20 or 30% against bleeding targets. Damage jumps to 30% when a target is below 50% health. Our first ring is the Rerouting Cable for a 5% shield for every 20 stamina units expended. This maximizes at 50% and resets after 5 seconds of inactivity. Next, I employ Blood Jewel, which allows all charged melee attacks to inflict bleeding for 620 bleed damage over 20 seconds. Our following ring will reduce this to 558. The Red Ring of Death duplicates damage status effects but reduces outgoing status effect damage by 10%. Lastly, synergizing with the Rerouting Cable, I employ Generating Band, which replenishes 3% of one's health per second while a shield is active. Moving on to the traits, I take the Engineer's Fortify, Vigor, Endurance, Spirit, Expertise, Arcane Strike, Bark Skin, Recovery, and Rugged. As for the skills, for the Bulldog Auto Shotgun and Huntress Spear pairing, I strictly stick with War Stomp for the Challenger and Guard Dog on Rufus. For the Coach Gun and Spectral Blade pairing, either War Stomp or Juggernaut can be used, though I still favor War Stomp more. Transitioning to our discussion. Now this onion would go as far as to say that this is a bleed-based build, but bleed damage is not necessarily intended to be the main means of enemy elimination. For this build, bleed damage acts more as a primer to dealing much greater damage. All weapons, whether it be due to their mod or their mutator, can inflict bleeding and corroded. The special feature about corroded is that targets will take 10% increased damage for the duration of its effect. With the addition of Ravager's Mark, Twisting Wounds, and Vampire Blade, Once a target is bleeding, their elimination is considerably faster. Rufus's main role is to aid with the blood spilling process and make the die-hard bulldog's job far easier. Additionally, Rufus serves as a distraction due to his guard dog threat generation. Now the two weapon sets give way to two slightly different strategies in combat. Speaking first on the auto shotgun and huntress spear, ironically for the challenger, distance is the main avenue for inflicting damage, particularly with the spear. One will have both bleeding and corroded status effects, killing most common enemies with a single throw, and the negative damage effects. If Rufus has already bled a given target, then the spear's efficacy increases. Now for tougher enemies, the blood jewel plays a much bigger role. After all, 558 bleeding damage over 20 seconds is not efficient at all. But again, the point is not necessarily to bleed enemies to death. What the blood jewel does is keep tougher enemies in the bleeding state for longer periods of time, especially if Rufus is already busy with other targets. At which point, one's weapons with raw fire become devastating. As a recovery and protection avenue, rerouting cable and generating band should be activated on a regular basis as one uses their spear, evades, or simply sprints for long enough. This is rather appropriate where attacking would be counterproductive to one's well-being. Plus, Red Ring of Death makes a stick and move style effective since ongoing damage from bleeding and corroded can persist at nearly double the efficacy. Now, the spear is not my favorite weapon for close quarters combat, but it can work with the right strategies. Some of you might be critical of my use of the blood draw mod, but this is intended to be an avenue for bleed damage and targeting multiple enemies at once. An answer to too many enemies up close is the War Stomp. The damage is not particularly high on its own, but the efficacy is increased against bleeding targets and is mainly intended to stagger and create some space from foes. Rufus is also a means of keeping enemies at bay with his guard dog howl and threat generation. This will also work to increase damage reduction. Now the Spectral Blade and Coach Gun are meant to function in a similar fashion. The Coach Gun adds more range to one's firearms, and the Spectral Blade is meant to compensate for the lack of corrosive damage and the Coach Gun's lower efficacy up close with the neutral evade charged attack. It's really a trade-off of the two weapon sets. Either one takes the range of their melee weapon with additional corrosive damage and increased close range efficacy of one's primary firearm, or greater melee efficacy and range on the primary weapon, but less close range efficacy of said weapon. Frankly, I enjoy both, but I have a slight favor for the Huntress Spear and Bulldog. Not only because of the corrosive stack, but also because of ammo preservation and versatility against foes with either resistance to corrosive damage or who simply don't bleed because they are ghosts. Now, although I am using the Challenger, the main tank in this build is Rufus. You mainly point the gun, or spear, and fire. Keeping him standing is paramount to the success of this proposed build, and relics will have to be used from time to time to achieve this. As long as enemies can be distracted, one will have the space to operate and deal with multiple attackers. One can almost think of this as a role reversal between Rufus and his handler. Instead of him keeping you alive with relics, you do the same for him, while the Challenger Prime perk demands no resources other than time or a World Stone. Now I construct these builds with the philosophy of, you can't lose if you don't die. They are ultimately meant to be generally effective enough to have an answer in virtually every circumstance, provided one's skill, or lack thereof, is not the reason for their demise. However, every archetype and pairing will have their fair share of weaknesses based on their natural abilities and the biomes they explore. Otherwise, that concludes our build for today. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.